The broadcast is now starting.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today on this lovely day. My name is Michael Wells. I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at PixelMill, and I am happy to have you guys here for our next installment of our PixelMill Webinar Series, uncovering the latest in SharePoint development. It's going to be a really good one today. A couple quick housekeeping things, stuff you're probably used to hearing, but just so you've heard it. There should be a questions tab for you. If you have any questions at any time throughout this webinar, please feel free to shoot them over to us. I'll be keeping an eye on them while Eric's presenting, and we'll get those answered as quickly as we can. If we're not able to get to them during the session per se, we will have a Q&A session at the end where we will address all of those questions. For those of you who are more into social media, feel free, if you have questions, use the hashtag PixelMillWebinars, and I'll keep an eye on that as well, and we'll try to answer those questions or comments you have coming from there. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Eric Overfield. Take it away, Eric.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon what time zone you're in. This has been a great international audience, and we have been excited to continue to host these. Okay, so back in the 1980s or so, early 1980s, my mom brought home for me and my brother this really cool compact, what was like the 880 or whatnot. It's a compact portable. It is about the size of a sewing machine. It weighed 40 odd pounds. Did any of you remember this? It had like this cool little 9-inch monochrome green screen. It had, like no hard drive really. It had 256 or 128K of RAM. It was like the coolest thing. And so my mom brought us like a basic book. So I learned basic and I wrote my first program. It was a standard hello world. I set a variable and then I printed out, enter your name, and it said, hello, Eric. And it was like the coolest thing. And so, okay, and you fast forward about like 10 years, and then I got into the whole BBS world and learned how to program in Pascal and then in C. And, you know, in order to learn, we were working with these big, thick books. We would get a new language every, couple of years. It was long. You had time to adjust to all these different changes. You had time to get the material, but it was also kind of hard to get external material because unless you were part of somehow had some cool user group that you could get to, there was no internet. There was really no easy way to share code and to ask questions. And has the world changed in development. And now it is insane at how quickly things are improving and changing. And we've definitely seen this in the SharePoint world where over the last 7, 12, 9 years, we've been seeing new versions of SharePoint every 3 years or so, and that provided new development models. But now the rate of change is just insane. We're no longer getting updates every 3 years. Rather, we're getting updates almost every couple months now on the new way to do things. And there's these new frameworks that come out. We're supposed to learn all these new languages, and there's these new back-end systems to use. And it is just crazy. It is just insane. And I recently read a quote that I thought was really good, which is, I'm paraphrasing, which is, however fast it seems that the rate of change is today, it will never be this slow again. And I do believe that. Things are changing so quick. We need to do what we can to stay up to date with the latest development. And I really think it's important to say, okay, well, where are we now in SharePoint development? Where have we been? Where are we? Where are we going so that we can correctly and quickly update our skill sets so that we can actually be relevant in the next, few months, if not for sure, the next year or two. So with that, I put together this session on what's coming up in SharePoint development. I look at this in the 100, 200 level stage level. We're not going to go deep into code here. That's not the point. The point here is to figure out what technologies are available to us and what can we do. A lot of references at the end. If you want this slide deck, as always, you can already download it. I'm leaving the screen up on purpose. On the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you should see the pixely/eo SharePoint dev URL. It is case sensitive, but that will allow you to download this slide deck right now. And in particular, what I want you to get are the references at the end. So that's real important stuff. So without further ado, I think we can go ahead and get started. Quickly, who I am, a little introduction. My name is Eric Overfield. I'm a Microsoft Regional Director, Microsoft MVP in the Office Servers and Services field, President, co-founder of PixelMill. worked a lot with SharePoint recently over the last, about since 2007 is sort of the date I pick. I've been working with it since 2001, but really I got heavy into it more about like 10 years ago. And I work a lot on the development side of SharePoint, and it's what I am. I'm a SharePoint geek. Those of you I've had the pleasure of meeting, you have seen that I love just geeking out on code and dev and whatnot. And so to me, trying to stay up to date and staying at the forefront, it's kind of fun. It's a cool thing, and I enjoy doing that. Quickly, who PixelMill is, who's hosting this webinar. We're a modern SharePoint design agency based out of California. If you're looking to build modern portals on top of SharePoint, on top of Office 365, give us a chance. We've done some really good projects. I think you'll really like the work that we've done. We're always looking to make beautiful UIs that really provide a good user experience, because at the end of the day, our projects are successful when your users adopt them. They adopt the sites that we create for you. Okay, overview. That was all the fun stuff. What I want to look at is I want to go back and look at the traditional development models within SharePoint, as well as look really at what's available to us today. Because a lot of the traditional approaches are still relevant. You can still use them. Just because I like building the latest TypeScript code on SharePoint Online does not mean that you're still building solutions on-prem or in SharePoint 2010. And you could still use some of the new modern development methodologies that are also coming down the road. We also want to look at the roadmap on development strategies, and then I want to finish with my suggestion of how you should be looking at development on top of the SharePoint platform, realistically on top of SharePoint 2013 and forward, on-prem and in the cloud, but some of the stuff is still very relevant for those of you stuck on SharePoint 2010 or before. So the traditional SharePoint models that are still relevant to today. Of course, we can start at the FullTrust farm-based solutions. These are solutions that we've been building since really 2007. It is an available option, something we can still use today on any on-prem environment that we have. If we're hosting our own SharePoint 2010 through SharePoint 2016, we can still build our own FullTrust farm-based solutions, and they work. They're those WSPs we've been building. We still can use these when we want to build completely custom web parts in C#. Totally do that. We can still build site templates within this, within on-prem environments, timer jobs, anything that has custom code, you can still build in FullTrust Solutions. That's not to say you always should, but you can. FullTrust Farm Solutions, they do require Visual Studio. Yeah, there's really no other way to do it. You can with command line, but no one does that. You're going to need some sort of development environment that you can build on that also has SharePoint Server installed. Or that's really the easiest way to do that. But again, still valid. You can still do this. And you're probably going to be programming in C#, maybe VB, but really I think most of us are on the C# world if we're building FullTrust solutions. So if you're on FullTrust, if you're on-prem, we can build these FullTrust solutions in Visual Studio. They then get deployed in two different real ways. We can deploy them via PowerShell, so you'd have to have PowerShell access into your SharePoint farm. Or if you have access to Central Admin, you can also install them there. The catch to this is that when you install a FullTrust solution, this will recycle the service application when you install it, and that will take your SharePoint site or sites down for that time it takes to recycle that service application. That could take seconds, that could take minutes, it could take longer, depends on your particular farm. And that's just, we've known this for a long time, but again, I like reiterating what the pitfalls are and what's good and bad about it. It's just something you want to consider, that when you're installing these things, you typically need to then build a window and say, okay, well, at Saturday at 2 a.m., we're going to go ahead and update our production farm with our FullTrust solutions, because effectively that's the only way to do that when we're going to production. So FullTrust solutions, I believe, are still very useful if you're on-prem, so no cloud, no 365, and you're never going to get that, so don't even think about it. If you want to be in the cloud, FullTrust is not going to be a solution for you. There's other methodologies that we'll look at. But if you want to have full control, you want to work with really anything within your SharePoint farm, on-prem is still useful. It's still around. It's not been deprecated. I can't believe it won't be here with the next version of SharePoint, so it's still something to consider. Introduced in SharePoint 2010, and still available through through current versions of SharePoint are the Sandbox Solutions. When SharePoint 2010 was being developed, Microsoft realized they needed to provide some more code isolation. One of the other pitfalls of FullTrust Solutions is once you install it, it really has access to your entire farm, or the code could have access to the entire farm. If you allowed me to install a FullTrust solution into your farm, depending upon how nefarious I wanted to be, I could take control of your farm. With Sandbox Solutions, that's not really the case. There's some code isolation going on here. And there's an on-prem version of Sandbox Solutions, and there's a cloud-available version of Sandbox Solutions. So if you want to build Sandbox Solutions for SharePoint Online, you actually can, and there's a piece of it that has not been deprecated. So the and what that means is, and how that works is that in on-prem, a Sandbox solution could have custom compiled code. It could have C# code that's installed as a DLL. It's compiled into a DLL, installed into your SharePoint environment, and it has that C# code. In SharePoint Online, that component, the ability to have custom compiled code has been removed. You can only build Sandbox solutions for SharePoint Online that are what's called declarative only. We still typically build our Sandbox solutions using Visual Studio. Again, it's really the only reasonable way to do it. You are, again, going to need that development environment that has SharePoint Server installed on it. It's really the easiest way to develop on top of SharePoint when you're building Sandbox solutions. You're probably going to develop in C# again if you're going to have compiled code. And when I talked about those declarative only solutions, you're going to be working primarily in XML. And what you're doing is you're going to be declaring assets that you want to install into SharePoint, which we'll get to in just a little bit, what I mean by that. You install Sandbox Solutions, in a sense, very similar to how you install FullTrust Solutions. You can install them via PowerShell or Central Admin. The new feature here is you can also install via site settings. So within a specific site collection, you could go into the solution gallery. You can upload your WSP, your Sandbox WSP, and you can install your Sandbox solution there via a browser. What's really good about that is that you will not recycle your service application when you're installing a Sandbox solution via the site settings, when you install that Sandbox solution only for a specific site collection. Not bad. It's useful. It works. There's reasons to use it. If you're looking to install some assets, if you're looking to install content types, page layouts, things like that, Sandbox Solutions, in the cloud in particular, Sandbox Solutions are definitely a good use for you. If you're on-prem, I'm not really seeing the value of Sandbox Solutions unless you're stuck on SharePoint 2010. I think that FullTrust Solutions are going to be easier for you if you're looking for something like this. It's more if you're looking to build solutions in the cloud and you're not ready to move to more modern techniques, or maybe you have some legacy applications, some legacy solutions. If you're looking to build something for the cloud that is declarative only and is only looking to install site columns, content types, list definitions, list instances, some pages, etc., where you're only installing declarative assets, that to me makes sense to use Sandbox even in the cloud. The catch is we do not know what the long-term support is in the cloud. Microsoft does not deprecate, I'm going to repeat this again because I keep hearing people go, no, that's not right. It is. Microsoft has not deprecated declarative only Sandbox solutions, nor have they put anything in the roadmap that says they're going to be deprecating them or shutting them down anytime soon. So to me, it's still a valid solution for you. It's still reasonable for you to go down that path if that's what you're most comfortable with. I would argue, though, that there are better models, though. If you're looking to use Sandbox Solutions on-prem, I would look more at FullTrust Solutions. If you're looking to have Sandbox Solutions in the cloud, I would suggest looking at new, better models to move forward, because if you're on the cloud, SharePoint Online, you've got some newer technologies that are much better. Introduced in 2013 is the new add-in model, originally called the app model. So what Microsoft found was that the Sandbox solutions were still really not isolated enough. In particular, what they found is that Sandbox solutions that had custom code in it was code that was still running within SharePoint, and that was a problem. Basically, in a cloud environment, I can't trust you to run compiled code, even though it's, quote, isolated. It may not be fully isolated, or maybe you're going to do an infinite loop that will shut down the entire farm for the entire cloud, and that could be a problem. So the add-in model was developed to help create a truly cloud-ready, isolated model where you could have custom code, custom C#, custom compiled code run outside of SharePoint in some other location that was isolated from SharePoint, yet could still communicate and work with SharePoint and could be included in the SharePoint UI. Add-ins must be hosted somewhere, though. They're still a solution. There's still something that needs to be hosted. And there's two types that are now left. There's the SharePoint hosted add-ins, and then there's provider hosted add-ins. If you're developing add-ins, you're going to need Visual Studio 2013 or above. You're still working in Visual Studio here. There's really no other good option at this point. You're going to need some sort of development environment to build the add-ins. SharePoint Online does offer a development site template, which does help in building add-ins. If you're building server-side code, you're probably going to be using C#. But if you want to have a SharePoint hosted add-in, so you want to have an add-in that's just hosted in SharePoint, you don't need any external service, you can use JavaScript as a really great language because you're going to be working with the interface now in the browser and using new APIs and APIs that were developed within SharePoint allow you to communicate with SharePoint to get data using something called client-side rendering. The add-in model also is the first model to include a marketplace distribution system. So this was at Microsoft, and they still manage this store where you can sell your applications. And currently, this is the only model available that already has a marketplace where you could build a solution for SharePoint and upload it into the store, get it approved, and then people can buy it directly from that store. Microsoft will then pay you, and they'll help the system will help the users install those applications into their SharePoint site, which is pretty cool. So SharePoint add-ins, they're really good for code isolation. They're an actual cloud-ready, isolated model that allows you to build some compiled code that lives outside of SharePoint, even on-prem or in the cloud, that has a model designed for that, but at the same time allows you to have just these sort of like declarative only or these SharePoint hosted add-ins that don't have compiled code, rather they're using JavaScript. And then also you get this external distribution model. The fact that you can build something, upload it into a store, and it gets sold, in a sense, for you by Microsoft is pretty cool. And as I said, it's currently the only model that Microsoft has provided for us that has a built-in store. I want to quickly talk about the different storage types of add-ins because people do seem to get confused a little. So SharePoint hosted add-ins, these are add-ins that are stored and hosted within your SharePoint site itself. They don't need any kind of external storage in Azure or something else, but they can only really provide declarative components such as lists or web parts, or out-of-the-box web parts that you want to install, workflows, custom pages, etc. Non-compiled code that the add-in will help push into your SharePoint site. Any custom code you have, though, must be ran client-side in the browser using something like JavaScript or maybe TypeScript transpiled into JavaScript. So really no C#. But since you don't need Azure, you don't need any external hosting, they're very easy to build, they're easier to host, and they're easier to just maintain.
Hey, Eric, I had a really great question come in.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries.
Do you have any info for creating JavaScript-coded proxy for cross-domain calls without using App Management Service? I was trying to use Request Executor without setting up a separate add-in site requiring purchase of another domain name.
Oh, that's a awesome question, and no. I run into that almost weekly, and it is really painful. Basically, if I'm going to reinterpret that question, it's loading cross-domain assets within a client-side rendering model. There really is no way to do that besides a proxy. That's a fun question that would require a full blog post to fully reply to. But the quick answer is I have not found a model for that works. I typically have to build a proxy that does the work using compiled code to go and get that data for me. And now that that proxy is in my same domain, I can then build my own API to talk to my proxy. Great question. Please keep them coming. Okay. Provider-hosted add-ins. So these are add-ins where the code is going to be, part of it will be hosted in SharePoint, but server-side code would be hosted elsewhere. Typically, this would be like if you had business logic that was just too complex for JavaScript, that would be stored over in Azure or stored in some other website outside of your site that would be running nice and beautifully. Typically, we see the add-ins, these provider-hosted add-ins are used for larger applications where your business logic is just too complex, or it needs to be proprietary or hidden, and you really can't expose all of that using JavaScript. But it does require that remote service where you're going to be hosting your logic, all that business logic, i.e. it's not actually hosted within SharePoint. Both SharePoint hosted and provider hosted add-ins they're loaded into your website using an iframe, which kind of, well, by the way, kind of helps with some of that cross-domain issue we're talking about. But it does provide isolation because the browser window itself, when you load a page, the SharePoint window itself can't really easily communicate with the iframe unless things are set up in a certain way, which you can not allow, which is really helpful. Because think about if you have two pieces of code, one written by me and one written by someone else. Let's say your SAP application. And we're not using a provider-hosted add, and we're not using iframes. We're using some sort of JavaScript client-side rendering kind of component. So SAP is doing something. Your SAP app is going and talking to SAP using a RESTful service to go get data, and it's going to display it on the screen. And then you got an add-in from me, and not an add-in, my little custom code, and you put my code on your page, and you really didn't read the JavaScript. You didn't look through my code. You just dump it in there, and I'm providing the weather, something simple. My little JavaScript web part, my little JavaScript can go and listen to all that communication happening over on that other JavaScript web part if there's no iframe isolation. If you didn't read my code, maybe I'm going to send back all that SAP information that's being sent back to the browser about some user's profile or something. That's a really big security problem that has not been solved yet with what we're going to be talking about, the SharePoint Framework, where we don't have iframe isolation. So add-in models are still really good when true isolation is needed and true security is needed around the add-in or solution that is provided.
We got another question, Eric.
Yes.
Why did they eliminate auto-hosted apps?
So there was a third model of hosting that was auto-hosted that they quickly got rid of, and I don't have the full story that I can share. Effectively, they didn't want to host anyone's code in any way. I really can't say much more on that. Apologize. Okay, so sorry that I can't answer that anymore. Yeah, I agree. Auto-hosted was nice. It was an ability to more quickly and easily deploy code using add-ins, and Microsoft got rid of it very quickly. They want to either have all of the code hosted over in your own environment. Maybe it was for money. They wanted more Azure subscriptions, or they want declarative only. Really, the SharePoint hosted that provide no custom code. They don't want to host anyone's code, anyone's compiled code. They want you to use something else. Okay, so all of the models I've talked about, they're still valid. You can still use them. They are not, in fact, dead yet. To me, it's that big yet, because I can't tell you. We don't know the roadmap. I don't know what's going to happen to FullTrust Solutions. I don't know what's going to happen to Sandbox Solutions or even the add-in model. None of them have been deprecated, though. So they're okay, I think, especially for your next build. Let's assume that a build lasts 3 to 5 years. You'll be okay. Let's say you upgrade to 2016 today, and you're going to keep 2016 around for 6 more years. Well, they're not going to turn off FullTrust Solutions for SharePoint 2016. I can't see that happening. I mean, anything's possible, but I just don't see that happening. And even if Microsoft did, they would have to provide it in some sort of feature pack or some sort of update. Well, maybe you won't install it. So you can control the upgrade cycle. You can control when you might get deprecated in an on-prem environment. Now, the cloud we've already talked about. So the cloud, we've got declarative sandbox. We have SharePoint hosted and provider hosted add-ins, and we have another model that we'll talk about shortly. And none of those have been deprecated. So I think, to me, long-term, at least short term for sure, you'll be okay. And it's okay to me to have a solution that will last 3 to 6 years because most likely within that time, so much will have changed, you'll want to replace it anyhow. So that's why I say just know why you're using a classic model if you're going to use one. I wouldn't recommend it, but I can't say that there's not reasons why. You have legacy code and it's just going to be quicker and simpler, and all of us have budgetary constraints. That's life. So FullTrust, you're on-prem, you're not going to the cloud. Are you sure about that? And you need to really have some deep integration in your farm? Great, use FullTrust. They work, they're powerful, they're strong, they can do a lot of stuff, and documentation's been written on that for over 10 years. Sandbox Solutions are good if you need something that's cloud friendly and really light touch, as long as it doesn't include code. Pretty simple. If you want a marketplace where that's cloud ready, ready to go with isolation, add-in models are definitely a model that still work for you and are totally valid. So to recap all of this, what are we looking at? FullTrust, everything's good except for online. Your Sandbox Solutions are good for everything but SharePoint 2007, as long as you don't have server-side code. The add-in model, still perfectly valid as long as you, for SharePoint Hosted, as long as you're on SharePoint 2013 or above. And provider hosted is the same as long as you understand that your provider hosted aspect of it is going to have to be stored somewhere. Azure, your own farm somewhere else, etc. Effectively, that needs to be some sort of web server, IIS, Apache, something that will host in a website-like experience the code that you want to have compiled. But let's look to the future. That's the past, yet still valid. We want to move forward, and the big takeaway I really want you to walk away with after this webinar is building client-side applications. We're looking forward to building modern applications where really all of the heavy lifting is happened on the client side in the browser using a language such as JavaScript or TypeScript that gets transpiled into JavaScript. Ideally using, because if you saw in all those other slides, I kept talking about Visual Studio. No, we want to start using open source tool chains that are much more flexible, that are much easier to install, much quicker to install, and are also cross-platform compatible. So client-side applications, these are typically based on JavaScript. Really, it's the best scripting language that's been accepted in browsers, or some sort of derivative such as TypeScript that will transpile into JavaScript, but we don't have to really think about that. Where we're building some pretty powerful, thick applications where all of the code, all of the rendering, all of the logic happens all within the browser. Now, of course, for good applications, we need to work with external data somehow, and Microsoft has provided quite a few of them. We've got the SharePoint REST API, we've got the new Microsoft Graph API, which is really powerful. We've got things such as Webhooks that allow us to be notified when something within SharePoint happens. Pretty cool stuff to interact with external data. Okay, now that we might have this data, we have this external data, we have the business logic, we then might need some help creating a beautiful interface on our page so that we can actually present that data in a way that will be adopted. And there's lots of frameworks and libraries out there to help us do this. We can use things like React or Angular or Knockout. These are popular libraries and frameworks that help with single page applications or these client-side rendering applications. Or something like the SharePoint Framework that Microsoft recently went to GA with about 4 months ago or so, 2017 here, to help us build these client-side rendered applications or web parts within SharePoint. And I put that all in the same line because just because the SharePoint Framework came out doesn't mean you might not use React on your own. You can still use classic experiences within SharePoint Online, or you might be using SharePoint 2016, let's say, and you can still use the classic script editor web part, or you're going to build your own page layouts that don't work with the SharePoint framework. Rather, they work with React or Angular or something like that, interacting with the SharePoint REST API to build your own client-side render or single-page applications within SharePoint. You don't need to use Microsoft's newest technique, which is the SharePoint framework. So much you can do using all this client-side components, but this is all cloud-friendly now and doesn't require you to have all that custom C# compiled code. What we want to do here is we're transferring the HTML rendering away from the server and we're putting it all in the browser. So we're going to be using the Seattle master page for SharePoint. We're going to be using, we're not going to be customizing that. Rather, we would use JavaScript injection, if possible, to load up our rendering. And now using JavaScript, hopefully JavaScript or TypeScript alone, we're interacting with raw data, JSON or XML data with the SharePoint REST API, Graph, Webhooks, etc., to go in Azure Functions to go grab data, to interact with SharePoint data, send and retrieve it using just data blocks such as JSON, and then all of the rendering all happens within the browser. If you don't take away anything else from this, I'm hoping that you take away at least that from this presentation if you forget the rest. Modern development in SharePoint, we're moving to the browser. We're going to try to get away from any sort of server-side code. So the primary building blocks that we have, well, you need to get data, of course. So one of the first things we're going to be using is most likely going to be the REST API, the SharePoint REST API, which has been introduced in SharePoint 2013. It's available in 2016 SharePoint Online. And what this does is it provides a RESTful service that allows us to work with our data within SharePoint, adding, removing, deleting, editing, updating, etc., just using HTTP requests. Pretty cool, pretty powerful, pretty simple. This is really similar to the client-side object model that was introduced previously in SharePoint, but is still around. It's just most of us have moved to the SharePoint REST API. It's a little easier to work with. This is really useful with our JavaScript and TypeScript code to be able to work with SharePoint data. So our JavaScript can create a simple request using basically an AJAX request or whatnot. It can send something, it can post a HTTP or get a HTTP request to a REST API endpoint. It can then work with the response and then re-render something on the screen to tell in the browser to tell the user what happened. Data was added, data was removed, here's the list of data that you requested, etc. One of my little complaints about the SharePoint REST API, and it makes sense when it came out, the data that's returned to you is always going to be an XML, which none of us really use anymore. In our JavaScript, it's much easier to work with JSON. So there is a way that when you create your HTTP request for the API, REST API endpoint, you can add a header, which is this content type application JSON, which tells SharePoint, hey, when you return data to me, don't return it in XML, return it in JSON. If you want to look at some quick examples, like how easy this really is, and you could actually create these posts now in SharePoint 2013 and above. This is a SharePoint Online example. But if you want to get a SharePoint list, let's say, you just add at the end of the specific web that you're working with, /API/list, and then get by title, would get the list by title, and this one is site pages, which is a team site basically. That's simple. The data that's returned to you is, if you add that header application JSON, a simple JSON, you can now work with that response and print out all the data for site pages, let's say. Let's say that you want to return just specific type of data within that. You can add some query string variables such as like select equals title. So I really only want to select the title of the responses from the getting of the list of site pages. There is so much information on the REST API that's just so cool that, I don't want to go into all the details here, but basically simple endpoints with lots of documentation that helps you figure out what endpoint you need. You can then get, post, update, delete, etc., your SharePoint data using simple endpoints. That all works really well in JavaScript. If you're on SharePoint Online, it might be really helpful to get a little more data. Maybe you want to work with more of your Office 365 tenant. Maybe you want to get things like all your groups, or you want to get some OneNote data, or you want to get all kinds of other cool stuff. That's where the Microsoft Graph API comes in, the single API to rule them all, so they say. One little catch to the Graph API is the permissioning model is kind of interesting, and it can require some time to get used to it. Basically, within Azure Active Directory, you need to create an application ID and a secret. So there's the Microsoft Application Registration Portal where you register your app ID and your secret. And then within Azure, you're able to provide the permissions you want that app ID to be able to work with. And there are a lot of things you can control, which is really cool, but also could be very confusing when you're trying to set these things up, because you might find a Graph API endpoint, and if you don't read the documentation very well, you won't realize the permissions required, and then it won't work, and that's kind of a pain. But there's a lot of information on Graph API. There are full day tutorials on how to work with the Graph API. What I care about for you to know is that at this point, you can work with a lot of your Office 365 data using the Graph API as long as you have that app ID and secret as your starting points. The general endpoints just works just like the REST API, are very similar. You've got your verb, you want to get, post, etc. You've got graph.microsoft.com, the version, then the resource, and then finally any specific query parameters. So as an example, if you want to get me, you want to get information about yourself, you can just get a GET request to graph.microsoft.com/v1.0. They're versioning, which is cool because they add more versions. You can still control that you want to just use an older version. So your code is much more shrink wrapped and isolated from any updates that Microsoft might make. And you can just add the me resource, and the Graph will return information about you, which is pretty cool. Well, just recently added to Graph API was the ability to grab information on SharePoint as well. So you can say that, well, the resource is I want to go into the site's resource, and I want to get the site demo group. Pretty simple, very similar to the REST API, a little more difficult to get set up just because you need that app ID and secret, and there's some token negotiation you need to do. But you can use the Graph API to get all sorts of really cool information on Graph. I snagged a screenshot from the documentation over at graph.microsoft.io, but I want to show you kind of like what Graph could get. Could get information on users, groups, files, mails, calendar, tasks, people, notes, all kinds of cool stuff, and they're constantly adding more. And this is external from SharePoint. This is not a SharePoint specific thing. This is more like think of an Office 365 portal application aspect sort of thing, where if you want to get all sorts of cool data, you can, all in the browser, all not using custom C# compiled code that has to be hosted somewhere. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, so you've got some tools to help you go grab data within SharePoint. Well, maybe you want to be able to have some tools to help you create a beautiful looking site. Aha, Office UI Fabric. That's where that comes in. You might have heard of this. I did a webinar on this a few months ago, and I've got a link for you in a second if you want to go get a whole hour on Office UI Fabric. But basically, the UI Fabric provides you an interface, an ability, a framework to build Office 365 and SharePoint front-end experiences that already look and have the feel of SharePoint. It's an open source project, which is excellent. I always like open source projects. Open source toolchain, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And you could go learn much more about this at dev.office.com/fabric. The primary pillars of this is that there are some styles in CSS that are provided to provide a look and feel that is very SharePoint-ish and very Office 365-ish. There's also some JavaScript components to it for interactions. So if you wanted to create, let's say, a panel on the right-hand side that came out, that appeared, and that you would then add your interactions in that, that's already built into the fabric. You don't have to think through how to build all the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. to make that panel look like Office 365. It's already built for you. There is another component, which is there's a React component, which is UI integration. It's basically a wrapper for the JavaScript interactions so that you can more natively work with UI Fabric within React. And then AngularJS, there's a community that did build an open source project around Office UI Fabric that is AngularJS ready, but it's not an official piece. It is an open source project off to the side. If you want to learn more about the UI Fabric, I did a whole hour on this over, and you can go get that on YouTube. My suggestion might be just to grab the slide deck because that URL is not the most friendly. So what I mean by UI Fabric and the core pillars, so the styles would be things like typography and color palette. There's even a responsive grid in there, so you can build your solution without having to think too much about the interface, because a lot of the interface design has been built for you, because you can just use the color palette that is already in Office 365 SharePoint Align ready color palette. You already got a typography, so it uses the same font. If you need a responsive grid, it's there. If you want icons, the official Office icons or document symbols or product symbols, those are already there in UI Fabric. You just set up your code correctly and say, I want to use the Excel icon. It will appear for you beautifully. If you want to have things like navigation or content blocks or people pickers or persona cards and more, all of that is already in UI Fabric. The documentation is pretty good. It's getting better, I think, and they provide you the installation instructions, the HTML structure you need, the classes that you need to use, the JavaScript you might need to use to quickly use the components, styles, and icons, etc. that Fabric provides. Great way to get started on the UI. But there's even more things available to us that we can use to go work with and grab and manipulate data within SharePoint. So recently announced was released with SharePoint Webhooks. And this is really cool. Well, we had this kind of thing in classic SharePoint where we're able to bind to events, but in a cloud model, that's not really the case. You can't bind to something. So instead what's available is this ability to subscribe via post, via HTTP request to specific SharePoint events, such as a list item is added to a list. Pretty cool. Okay, so we wanted to have some sort of hook to say that, hey, if an item is added to a list, I want to do something. Maybe I want to control the ability of adding new groups. I don't want anybody to add a new group into my SharePoint Online or Office 365 environment. Rather, I'm going to build a simple form. That form will be using the REST API to add data to a form, to a list, so that I can fill out and say, I, user, would like a group, and it's going to do these things, and here's who's the leader is going to be, the owner is going to be, and the secondary owner will be, here's the purpose of it, here's some initial users I want to have access to it, etc. I click submit. That data gets pushed into a list. Now that I have that list item was added, I want to be notified, or I need a system to be notified so that an admin can then be told, hey, a new group has been requested, would you please approve this? And you could do that using something like webhooks. Now you can use that doing, there's other techniques like flow, etc., but webhooks is another technique. And it's that secure mechanism so that you'll be notified when specific SharePoint events get occurred, where you're building your own application somewhere else and you want to be notified something's happened because maybe custom C# code or something needs to do something to maybe make all that happen. So whatever it is that you want to have happen. Another really cool component that's been around for a little while are Azure Functions. These are really cheap, inexpensive ways to do very simple, even complex, to run specific pieces of code. So Azure Functions provide, they typically run in Azure, they run on demand. They're code that is considered based on a serverless architecture. You're not building a server, you're not running IIS, you're not having to build a whole web server. Rather, you're able to have this custom code that's hosted in Azure in a protected, isolated way. It's event-based, so when a URL, that Azure Function URL is called, that function you have is run on demand, and you're only billed for those typically nanoseconds, microseconds that function is used. So you might have an Azure function that is that runs anytime you have a specific webhook that you've subscribed to, gets posted to the Azure function, let's say, and that Azure function might go and run some compiled C# code for you, all based on this endpoint that's registered by your Azure function. Very cool that you can build some cool, simple code that runs for micropennies per second of time. It's cool stuff. It allows you to build that C# code basically and have it run on demand and do something to your SharePoint or Office 365 environment. Now you can actually go, of course, one step further with Azure Functions and build more like a full Azure app. You can build a full external application in something like Azure, or maybe even your own, outside of Azure, let's say, but let's just stick to Azure here. Using any kind of architecture of your choice. So you want to run this on Linux using Apache, great. You just provide in these application you build in your full web server that you're building different endpoints that you want SharePoint to communicate with. Effectively, you're kind of building your own REST API. That's one way to do it for sure. And it can do anything. Like at that point, your code can do anything you want. It's code that you've built using the language and the architecture of your choice. And you can do anything, and it's really powerful. So to me, moving away from FullTrust Solutions, if you want to move into the cloud, you would be using something like Azure Functions or Azure Apps to build some heavy lifting business logic, and that you then have SharePoint using your own secure REST API that you might build, you can then communicate with your Azure Functions or Azure Apps to provide the heavy lifting and then return JSON back to your client code, back to your JavaScript that could then render it nice and beautifully.
So Eric, we had a few questions come in.
All right.
I'll start with the most recent one because it's related to what you're talking about right now. Can an Azure function be passed parameters via URL?
Yes. Absolutely. Definitely via URL, and I know you can do it in the payload as well. Yes.
Great. And then jumping.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I wasn't sure if you were done. So then jumping back a little bit, what form tools are you using now that InfoPath is going away?
That's a fun one. Okay, so InfoPath is, quote, going away. Yes, okay, in like 8 years. So if you're using InfoPath, still use it. It's fine. That's kind of my quick one is that use it. As a company, I can tell you what we have done is we've moved to client-side rendering forms that are interacting with SharePoint lists using the REST API for intranet applications. So and then we lock down the list potentially dependent upon security. Okay, what I mean by that is, let's go back to my example where you want to lock down groups, so you have to request a group. Okay, so on your portal homepage, you might have a button that says request a new group. When you click that, a dialog appears, a panel appears, an overlay appears, a new page appears that says, excellent, you want a group? No problem. Tell us about your group. And when you press submit, the data is wrapped up and using REST API is pushed into a hidden list where users only have add access. So nobody can edit it, nobody can really view it, but they can add data to it. I understand it's a little more complex to do that just because you do need a coder to do it. And I know at the point InfoPath is you don't need that, but it does seem to provide the best kind of like client-side rendering technique to be able to create those forms. There are a lot of form libraries that people have created. There are third-party vendors who've created some forms, form tools. I can't really recommend any offhand. There's a lot of good ones because I don't want to leave anybody out because I know there are lots of good ones out there. Yeah, the last one is where Microsoft wants us to go is Power Apps. Power Apps are cool. They're good. They create great forms, and they're good for simple forms. The problem with Power Apps is you're going to find that most likely after working with it for 30 minutes, when you start trying to do some complex stuff, you're going to hit a wall, and that seems to be a shame. But if you want to create more simplistic forms on top of SharePoint that you also want to be mobile ready, mobile friendly, which is not a bad thing, Power Apps is definitely Microsoft's solution for you. That all being said, I think that Microsoft appears to be putting a lot of weight behind Power Apps. I do expect them to greatly increase in their ability over the next months, quarters, and years to really fill in those gaps so that you don't need to build custom forms using my technique of JavaScript. You don't need to use third-party solutions. Rather, you can get pretty powerful forms all built in the browser interacting with your SharePoint data.
Great, and you saying all that caused an avalanche of comments and questions. So I'll give you the option, Eric. Do you want to answer all these now or address these now, or do you want to wait a little bit to come back to them? Not that I would rather. Not that I'm blowing up anybody's questions.
Yeah, I love the questions. I mean, I'm here for you guys. So
okay. So staying on this topic, people mentioned the different kinds of forms, including Microsoft Forms that just came out.
Sure.
So that's one thing.
And those are cool. We started using those. You're right. Our business analysts started using those and started playing with them, and they look interesting. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Quick little sales pitch. We do have a blog out with her thoughts on Microsoft Forms. If anybody wants to check that out. And then let's see. Another question, an actual question that came in was, can Azure Function connect to on-prem SQL Server database? I know API apps can through Hybrid Connection Manager.
You should be able to. An Azure Function should be able to interact with most any external data as long as those endpoints are available. So Azure Functions are still C# code. It's isolated though, which is cool. I haven't tried. I don't know, but I don't see why you couldn't do it.
Awesome. Okay. And then a couple people mentioned Power Apps and how they're going to be in the future, replacing InfoPath.
That's kind of what Microsoft is saying. Yep, sure.
Exactly. And then,
cool
And then, will Power Apps be available for .gov domains?
I can't tell you one way or the other. I don't know. I would think so. I know that the government cloud in particular is trying to get more parity. It's just a slower rollout. But I don't have a timeline to that, so I can't provide you the roadmap specific to that.
Gotcha.
I would think
so.
But I would, it'd be better to know, is it going to happen in 6 months? Is it going to happen in a year, 2 months, etc. But I don't see why they would be limiting something like that.
Gotcha. Okay. And then someone mentioned dynamic forms as another option that's starting to appear.
Yep.
Our good friend. Yeah, there's a lot of different options showing up. Thank you everyone for putting in your comments about that. Our dear friend Dave Lavelle added in a link to an article about Azure Functions and how they can connect to on-prem. In case anybody wants to check that out, there should be in the questions. I will make sure that gets blasted out too in our recap of this later on. And then the last question. Thank you, Dave. Always a valued member of our team. And then the last question actually jumps back to Office UI Fabric. Is Office Fabric UI only available for cloud offerings?
I like that one. No. So UI Fabric can be used anywhere. And when I mean anywhere, I do mean like you can build a complete app not on SharePoint, not on Office, not on Microsoft, and you can still use Fabric UI. It is completely isolated. It's just CSS and JavaScript with some guidelines on how to set up the HTML class ID structure in order to use the CSS and JavaScript. So, I like that one. And that I should have said it, so thank you very much for asking that question.
And that's the end of the question avalanche. Thank you everyone who's on the call. This has been the most fun question session we've had so far. But feel free, Eric, to go ahead and move on.
Yeah, and we've got a few minutes, so I'm going to try to keep moving forward. Okay, so we talked about all of the tools you might be using. I'm going to rephrase that. I talked about all the tools you should be using in all of your upcoming and hopefully current SharePoint customization development strategies. So now I want to talk about how you're going to be building all of this stuff. We want to move away from Visual Studio and move into an open source tool chain. Definitely the way to go on client-side rendering. We're going to be creating our web interfaces using, you Visual Studio people are going to freak out, command line driven tool chain. You're going to have to go back to command line, but I'm telling you, once you get over the first 5-minute hurdle, it is really cool, and it's just so much easier to use in my opinion. But we're using open source tooling, good and bad, mostly good, because it's free, it's open source, you can change it, you can work on it, and it improves very quickly. The communities are constantly adding new features. The primary tool chain that I'm hoping that you're going to be using is going to be based on top of Node.js. Node.js is our application framework that is going to be the base of how we're going to build and maintain our applications. We use an add-on to that called npm to bring in packages. So we want to be able to say we want these 5 or 10 modules, but we don't know what all the submodules are needed. Those modules may have dependencies. We want something to maintain all that for us. That's where npm comes in. We really want to have some sort of templating engine, something that will allow us to quickly spin up a new project based around a currently defined idea, such as, hey, we want to start a new SharePoint Framework web part. We're going to use Yeoman for that. We need something to help us build all of our code. So every time we make a change, everything needs to get recompiled, transpiled, uploaded, etc. We want to have a testing environment that doesn't require SharePoint to test what we're doing. We're going to use Gulp for that as a task runner. We want a new language, preferably, because JavaScript just isn't strong enough. We want something that's more strongly typed, that provides a little more structure to our code, and that's where TypeScript comes in. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about really is the framework on the front end, the UI component, which you can do it yourself, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the work that I do is still just raw HTML, JavaScript, etc. But if you want a framework, a library to help you build our UIs that are interactive, we would be looking at something like React and Angular. I'm not going to go into too much detail on these specific components past what I've just said, but open source toolchain is definitely the way to go to move forward. Now the SharePoint way of integrating everything I've just talked about, well, the modern stuff I just talked about, is the SharePoint framework. It's not so much as a big reveal as it used to be because it's not totally new. It's been in GA now for 4 or 5 months now. They just released another huge update to it, which is in, I believe they're calling it Developer Preview. Developer Preview Drop 1, which is on extensions, so they're helping us build even more powerful interfaces on top of SharePoint. What this is the SharePoint Framework it's a page and web part model. It's really currently a web part model, but they're moving it into a page model that is built within SharePoint, built for SharePoint, that allows us to build those client-side SharePoint components, primarily as, again, web parts, but we're getting more of a page model. We're using all of the client-side rendering techniques that I've already described, and it has the hooks for most of the extra components and tools I've talked about as well, such as the REST API, and they're working on the Graph API. Perfect. It uses the open source toolchain. Excellent. Now, the toolchain I've talked about here, Node, NPM, Yeoman, Gulp, etc. A lot of us in the SharePoint world, we've been using this for a couple of years now. So it's great to see that the framework noticed the same trends in global web development and decided to pick those up as well. There's already a REST API wrapper built into the framework that is outrageously simple to use. It's really cool. It's built into the context. And then that native Microsoft Graph API, when I say it's in the works, they're actually past in the works, but they're building abilities to interact with graph data much more quickly. It's a little limited at the time, and there's reasons why, but it's pretty cool that you can do that. The web parts that are allowed, that are GA, they do work in classic and modern pages. So you can build your modern web parts now, and you can build them for classic SharePoint pages within SharePoint Online, which I should have said, which is this is currently only available in the cloud. So only SharePoint Online can use SharePoint Framework web parts, except on-prem. SharePoint 2016 is going to get, they've made it clear, Feature Pack 2 is going to get the SharePoint Framework on-prem. So they say second half of 2017, which is right around the corner. People have started to see some bits, so it's definitely going to happen. I do believe it's going to happen eminently, that we'll be able to build SharePoint Framework web parts on SharePoint 2016. SharePoint 2013, you're out of luck, so not going to happen. So I want to go back to, currently we have web parts. The extensions I've talked about is in preview. What the extensions allow us to do is have sort of like a JS link replacement where we can work with aspects within, say, a SharePoint list, but they've also given us this application layer so that we can add and inject, say, a header onto every single modern SharePoint page, which is pretty cool. The framework is constantly improving, and they have a good, solid roadmap for it that will be fun to look at. If you are a Visual Studio diehard and you must use Visual Studio, there is a open source project that just came out recently that is, it provides a Visual Studio extension that basically wraps the SharePoint Framework command line. So you can use Visual Studio to say, I would like to create a new SharePoint Framework web part, and it will go and do all the command line stuff for you. So really big thanks to two people in particular, Eric Schups and Paul Schaeflin, for making this happen. This is completely open source, completely community driven. They did it. It's really cool. So I got some links for you if you want to learn all about it. If you want to move into Visual Studio. It's basically, as I said, a wrapper to SPFX command line right now. I would recommend you learn the command line. But if you love Visual Studio and you want to stick with it, great. I'm a big Visual Studio Code proponent. I really like that. It's an open source, so those of you who haven't worked with it, Visual Studio Code, open source, free, works on all major platforms. It's pretty powerful, and it provides some really good interactions with TypeScript. But I will admit that the Visual Studio IntelliSense for TypeScript is better. So I can see why you might want to work with Visual Studio, because it works with TypeScript better than even Visual Studio Code does. So if you want to do it, you've got it, and it's out there. How am I doing on time? I'm going to skip the demo because it's really not that big a deal. The demo I really wanted to show is just the SharePoint framework, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen it or can see it. It's not overly complex to really see it, but client-side rendering. That's where I want you to get at, and that's all that demo was really about. Okay, so let's discuss the roadmap though. What's happening and moving forward? Okay, so this is all from Microsoft. They told us this is what's going to happen, so I'm not giving anything away. The spring or summer of 2017, which is effectively now, we're supposed to get Webhooks goes to GA, SharePoint Framework goes to GA, Microsoft Sites on the Graph goes GA, WebPart Connection Preview is supposed to be out, as well as the SharePoint Framework Extension Preview is supposed to come out. The later part of this year, particularly really the second half, because, well, that's 2 days away. SharePoint extensions should go GA. WebPart connections should also go GA, which is great. The native graph access into the SharePoint framework will be really cool, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Almost every project I work on now on SharePoint Online is using graph, because typically it's because we want to interact with groups and group data, and you need really graph to do that. We got some ALM APIs that are coming out, and then the SharePoint framework on-prem, at least the web part component, is supposed to come out sometime in 2017 in Feature Pack 2. Well, so how are we doing? Well, not too bad. So far, Microsoft has done everything they said they would do in spring or summer of 2017 around SharePoint deployment, which is awesome. SharePoint framework extensions only came out a couple weeks ago, but they did it. That's when they said they were going to launch it, and they did. So very, very cool. I'm definitely looking forward to the second half of this year to see those extensions and the web part connections come across. And that native graph is going to be just awesome. Really, really cool stuff. So my recommendations, kind of where I'm going to end this up. First and foremost, I really say you got to stay current. If you haven't done it already, you've got to start moving. You got to look at and really transition to client-side rendering. You need to move, in particular, all of your HTML rendering away from the server and move it into the browser. Your services that you might build, if you need to build proxies to be able to talk to cross-domain information talked about earlier in this webinar, you need to do heavy business logic. The data that goes from the browser to your external service should just be a JSON request or an HTTP request, and the data that comes back should be JSON. It should just be data, and all of the rendering happens within the client side. And I know a lot of us programmers, that can be kind of scary as well, because now we have to build more beautiful interfaces, things that look a little more pretty. Let the UI fabric help you there so that you don't have to worry so much about it. Your application will look more like SharePoint out of the box already, and you can work on the cool business logic providing that business value to your organization. Those custom services that you were building on-prem, get them out of SharePoint, and that's staying current. I've been saying FullTrust Solutions make sense. Sometimes they do, but I would ask that you start looking to move them off. For those of you that are saying we're never moving to the cloud, I still got to say never's a long time. I just don't think that never is really reasonable. Things are going to start moving to the cloud. Your organization is going to start going hybrid. I might see that some financial data, some customer data, it can't live in the cloud. You're going to need to have team sites in the cloud. But so many portals I'm seeing are moving to Office 365, and it makes complete sense to me. It's so cheap. And so a lot of your data is going to live in SharePoint, is going to live in the cloud, and that's okay. So you want to do what you can to move your custom server-side code out of SharePoint and into a cloud service, an external service, or if you're lucky, or hopefully, you can just use the SharePoint API or the Graph API. It's time to move a little bit away from C# and from Visual Studio if possible and start learning the open source toolchain. You're really going to need it for SPFX if you're going to move into modern SharePoint development, modern SharePoint Framework development. You've got that option for Visual Studio, which is great. It's a good crutch, but the quicker you learn Node.js, NPM, Gulp, the quicker you learn those aspects, the better you're going to do. You're going to be able to build your TypeScript solutions more quickly. You're going to be able to work with Sass instead of CSS more quickly, and you're going to be able to quickly build your code and push it up into SharePoint, all much more simple than we could have done with full compiled code. For those of you that are on SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2016 on-prem, all of your customizations moving forward, 99%, if at all possible, are going to happen in SharePoint Framework web parts. You are not going to customize the master page anymore. You're going to use classic team sites, modern team sites, classic portals, classic publishing portals as needed for heavy, big portals. for the backend structure of SharePoint. You're not going to touch that. You're going to use JavaScript, TypeScript, CSS, SharePoint Framework Web Parts to provide all of the customization on the UI. That's the best solution I can tell you. That's like the second thing I'd like you to pull away from this is how are the current best practices on top of SharePoint. You're doing everything on the client side using modern SharePoint Framework Web Parts, even if you're using classic pages, because maybe modern pages are still too restrictive. I get that. There is no publishing model replacement. Communication sites, that's one of the new big site templates for SharePoint Online. I strongly believe those are not portal replacements. They're really good maybe for a group that wants to communicate with the organization, but your corporate intranet, your PixelMill intranet where you need to serve 70,000 people or 20,000 people or 1,000 people or even 200 people, you really are going to need something a little more strong than the communication portal provides. The publishing infrastructure still has value and it has not been deprecated in any way. Great, use it, but all of your customizations on top of that should live within CSS, JavaScript, and the SharePoint Framework Web Parts. You're not customizing the master page, even in on-prem environments. There are great techniques to leave that alone. Don't know if I said that strong enough, but it's kind of one of my biggies. Okay, so what do we talk about here? We talked about the traditional models that are still totally valid, still totally usable. No reason why you can't use them. We talked about then modern development methodologies that you can use without SharePoint Framework. You could just build those on top of SharePoint now, that being the modern toolchain, open source, that being the REST API, Graph, Azure Functions, etc. Basically, we're trying to remove all of the business logic from SharePoint, and we're working with our data using client-side rendering. We looked at the roadmap, and then we ended there with kind of like my best recommendations. Really, that last one being you're building all your new customizations in SharePoint Framework Web Part or client-side rendering, and you then can use classic or modern experiences moving forward. Okay, my resources. I have a bunch here. The best suggestion I have is you want to download my slide deck because there's just too much here. But I've provided you the best intros I could find to all of the major components I talked about. And then at least, Dave, thank you for providing the link on adding external data within Azure Functions. If anyone else has any other links, please post them. We will get a blog post up hopefully, Friday might be tough, it's the July 4th holiday, as soon as we can, and we'll try to post everyone's comments, questions, answers, and other links to help you get started and help you move forward with your customizations within SharePoint. If any of you are going to be in Seattle in August, I hope you join me at SharePoint Fest Seattle in August 8th through the 11th. I'm doing a full day workshop effectively on this session, but we're going to go much more into code. It's much more a 300 level where we're going to look at the PnP initiative within SharePoint and Office 365, but we're really going to go into developing best practices, and we'll look at lots of really cool examples. And then on Thursday, I'm doing a session on an intro to the SharePoint framework. So if you want a full hour and 10 minutes on the SharePoint framework on how to get started, please do that. If you want to save $100, you can go to spfest.com. When there's a promo code, just use a promo code of Overfield Seattle 100, and you can save yourself $100. So with that, I really want to thank everybody for their time, for joining us. We say we're going to go to 12:15 p.m. Pacific, and I'm more than happy to stick on for any more questions that people have.
I've got a couple questions that came in, and still there's actually still a request, a very heavy request to still do the demo. If you're able to do that, people were really looking forward to seeing that. So if you're willing to do that, Eric, still, that'd be cool. But
sure. So the demo that I had was a SharePoint Framework Web Part. So I've already gone through and I've looked at, I've already installed like a tool chain, and what I can show you here is I'm running Node-V, which is giving me a version of Node. So I'm running one of the more current versions of Node, 4.4.7. And I've gone through the SharePoint Framework installation because that's a whole hour session on how to set all that up. And I've already installed it, I've already downloaded, I've already built a framework web part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run Gulp, which is that task manager I talked about, and Task Runner, and I'm going to run Gulp Serve. All the documentation on this is already available within the SharePoint Framework web part links that I've provided. So I'm going to let that spin up. Now what happened is I have a bunch of code. Now if you want this code, no problem. Another link I don't know if I provided there, but it's github.com github.com/eoverfield. Try to remember my name, go to eoverfield. If you go to repositories, you're going to find a whole bunch of SPFX demos. You can just download this whole, you could download a zip of this whole repository here, or you can clone it if you know Git. And I'm in the React web part demos folder. I've created a whole bunch of React demo web parts that they help me in these kind of demos, but you can download them as well, and you can use them all you want. So I've already gone into one of the folders. I hit gulp serve, and it spun up the workbench. So this is SharePoint Framework, the workbench. I could be on a plane flying to and from Sweden, and I don't need an internet connection, and I could be developing SharePoint Framework web parts. Now, isn't that pretty cool? I think it is. So, of course, if I shut my internet connection down, I lose you all. But we can see that I have a bunch of web parts that are available within the demo code that I've provided. And one of them is, say, the poll. Okay, so poll, I just added it. I click configure. I can provide some information and click apply. And I can say, oh, well, what's the best language? So I'm going to say React and vote. And never mind. I actually want to vote for another one. React, vote. Let's do React again, vote. And we can see we get some charts show up. I don't know why the React Angular just disappeared. But this can then work with SharePoint real well. Okay, stupid little demo. Let's look at the code, though. I think the code is a little more entertaining. So the code itself is, this is SharePoint Framework, but what we can see here is we're using NPM, and we're using Node. Now, how do I know that? Because of my packages, I need to grab a whole bunch of dependencies. But I don't have to know about all of the hundreds of sub-dependencies each of these dependencies have. I'm using gulp as a task runner, so I'm able to run gulp serve. Gulp runs gulp file, and it runs some tasks. Now, this is actually a very small gulp file, by the way, but it's running a task which Microsoft built for us, which is this build task. But you can customize this and do some cool things. Now, the poll in particular, it's using TypeScript and is using Sass in order to build CSS. Within the TypeScript, it uses React. Within React, so I have a React element, and I want to create an element main, and I'm sending it a whole bunch of properties. So that's all this cool stuff you can build here. And again, this is like a full day demo here I'm trying to give here in 3 minutes. Now within that component, I'm actually loading up more React, and I'm saying, oh, hey, what I really want to do is I want to run this main component that I have built. This main component can do some really cool things like, oh, it needs to be configured, so I want a configuration panel. But once it's been configured, I then want to show the poll. And then I can keep drilling down into these. Oh, that's weird. I thought I had closed Skype. Within these components, I can have some components and subcomponents and subcomponents. So really cool stuff. So like my demo is kind of simple and quick, but I'm trying to show is I'm using the modern toolchain, which works really well. I'm using TypeScript. I'm using gulp to help compile all this stuff. I'm using SharePoint Framework in order to help build the web parts and the components. I'm doing this all offline if I want to, because I don't need to actually have an internet connection to develop and test out and build solutions to see how my web parts might work and interact with each other. Even I'm going a step further where I've added multiple web parts. We can see I've actually added multiple web parts into one specific package of web parts. So I have 4 web parts all put, or 3 web parts all put together, or 4 web parts. Pretty cool stuff, and it works well. And I'm not using Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio Code, the open source tool chain. So it was a simple demo. That was why I kind of skipped it in interest of time, but I hope it kind of helped people a little bit see a lot of those interactions come together. Now I'm going to give the reveal. I'm still in it for Michael. Next month, July 23rd, Michael can confirm, we are doing another webinar on React and the SharePoint framework. So if you want to look at how all these demos were put together, that's what I'm going to do next month. We're going to tear this apart. We're going to look at React. We're going to look at the SharePoint framework. We're going to see why this code works and how it's all put together and why it's useful.
My only update to that is it's July 27th.
July 27th.
Yeah.
So what are the other
questions?
What questions?
The last one, we're right at our time. The last one I can probably get you to answer is, what is the difference between webhooks and flow?
Very different, but I like the question. Okay, so flow is Flow is I have to put my thoughts together here. Flow is a workflow that you're adding directly into a list. So it's more like a simple workflow, and it can have multiple steps to it. Webhooks are when an event occurs, a URL is triggered that could then grab that particular event that occurred. But it's not really workflow. It's just one specific action occurred. An item was added. Great. Tell me that item was added. A subweb was created. Great. I want to know that a subweb was created. A list item was updated. Great. I want to know a list item was updated and what list item was in fact updated. Whereas flow can be more of a total workflow. Okay, when a list item is added, go notify Michael to tell him that he needs to go approve it. Michael can then approve it, and then it goes back into say that, well, now his manager needs to approve it as well, etc. Does that sort of make sense? And Flow is all browser-based to create. It's much more just a simple workflow engine, whereas Webhooks really is code. You need to register an endpoint to say, hey, webhook, when an event occurs, go trigger this URL over here, and then I need to go build an application over at that URL to go do something with that information, such as a list item was updated.
Great, and that is our time. We ran right up to our time today. Thank you, everyone, for having amazing questions and for really putting Eric through the ringer. He loves answering that kind of stuff, so thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Like Eric said, our next webinar is in July. We'll be sending out that information. If you want to go back and look at anything Eric's done or listen to this again, we'll have a recording and up hopefully by Monday. My goal is by Monday. We'll get that up soon if you guys want to go back and review anything. And that's pretty much it. Again, thank you guys for joining us today. You've been an amazing audience, probably the best one we've had so far. Eric, any closing thoughts?
No, really appreciate everyone joining us. I look forward to next time. Let us know if you have any further questions, and otherwise, have a great day.
Have a great day, y'all. We'll see you next time.
Thanks all.